January 17th, 1944. Somewhere over the frozen fields of occupied France, the sky is a pale sheet of winter white. At 28,000 feet, the air is thin and bitterly cold, so cold that moisture freezes instantly on the inside of cockpit canopies, and every breath feels like inhaling shards of glass. Below, the patchwork of snow-dusted farmland stretches endlessly, stitched together by narrow roads and the skeletal lines of bare trees. The drone of engines fills the air a deep, rhythmic thunder that vibrates through metal and bone alike high above the earth. A formation of American B-17 flying fortresses pushes eastward into German airspace, their silver fuselages gleaming dully in the winter light. Each bomber is a fortress of rivets and aluminum, bristling with .50 caliber machine guns, carrying tons of high-explosive ordnance destined for industrial targets deep in the Reich. But the men inside these machines know a terrible truth. They are flying into the heart of the most lethal air defense system ever created. The Luftwaffe owns these skies, and for months the odds have been stacked brutally against them. In the lead bomber, the pilot's hands grip the yoke with white-knuckled tension. His eyes scan the horizon, searching not for the target ahead, but for the enemies he knows are coming, because they always come. The Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, sleek, deadly, flown by pilots who have been killing Allied bombers for years. The American fighters that usually escort them, the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, are good machines, reliable, but they lack the range to go all the way. Somewhere over Belgium or the Dutch border, those escorts will peel away, their fuel gauges edging toward the red, and the bombers will continue alone into the lion's den. That's when the slaughter begins. But today, something is different. Tucked, and alongside the bomber formation, weaving gracefully through the contrails, are fritters unlike any the Germans have seen in these skies before. They are slender, elegant, with gracefully curved wings and a distinctive profile. The fuselage is long and smooth, painted in olive drab and gray, with the white star of American air power emblazoned on the wings. The nose is elongated, almost predatory, housing a liquid-cooled Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that gave the British Spitfire its legendary performance. These are North American P-51 Mustangs, and they are about to rewrite the rules of the air war over Europe. The German pilots have heard of the Mustang. They have encountered it in small numbers over France, primarily in the low-altitude reconnaissance and ground attack role. In the officers' clubs and ready rooms scattered across Luftwaffe bases from Normandy to the Polish border, the Mustang is regarded as something of a curiosity, a decent enough fighter at low altitude, perhaps, but nothing to fear. Certainly not a match for the high-performance interceptors that have ruled the skies over the Reich. The Mustang, they say with casual confidence, is just another American machine. Solid engineering, perhaps, but lacking the aggressive performance and combat pedigree of German fighters. The Americans, they believe, are good at building bombers and tanks, but air combat, real air combat, at high altitude, where speed and climb rate are everything, that is a German specialty. So when the first reports come in that Mustangs are escorting bombers deeper into German territory, the reaction is dismissive. Let them come. Let the Americans send their pretty little fighters eastward. They will turn back when their fuel runs low, just like all the others. And if they don't turn back, they will die. But the Mustangs do not turn back. To understand what happened in the skies over Germany in 1944, we must first understand the crisis that brought the Mustang into existence. By the winter of 1943, the American strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany was in desperate trouble. The 8th Air Force, based in England, was tasked with destroying the industrial heart of the Third Reich, the factories, refineries, and transportation hubs that fed Hitler's war machine. The theory was elegant: precision daylight bombing, using heavily armed bombers in tight formation, could cripple Germany's ability to wage war without the inaccuracy and civilian casualties associated with British night bombing. But theory and reality were diverging catastrophically. The reality was measured in blood and burning, wreckage scattered across the European landscape. Bomber losses were staggering. On missions deep into Germany, attrition rates sometimes exceeded 20%. 20%. 1 in 5 bombers failing to return. Some missions were worse. On August 17, 1943, during a raid on ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17s out of 376. Dispatched nearly 16% in a single day. Another 168 bombers were damaged, many so badly they would never fly again. 600 men were killed, wounded, or captured. The air crews began to calculate their odds of survival with grim mathematical precision. A tour of duty was 25 missions. If losses continued at 15 to 20% per mission, the statistical probability of completing a tour was effectively 0. The problem was simple and seemingly insoluble. The bombers could not defend themselves against determined fighter attack. The Luftwaffe had developed tactics specifically designed to massacre bomber formations. Flights of Bf-109s and Fw-190s would approach from head-on, where the bomber's defensive firepower was weakest, closing at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, firing cannon and machine guns into the cockpits and engine nacelles, then rolling away before the bomber gunners could track them. Other fighters attacked from below, where the bomber's belly gun positions offered limited coverage. Still others would stand off beyond the range of the .50 caliber machine guns and lob rockets into the formations, hoping to break up the defensive boxes and isolate individual bombers for destruction. The American fighters of 1943, P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning, were capable machines, but they had been designed for different missions and lacked the range to escort bombers all the way to targets in central and eastern Germany. The P-47, a massive radial-engined fighter, was rugged and heavily armed, but it could barely reach the German border before having to turn back. The P-38, with its distinctive twin-boom design, had better range but suffered mechanical problems. In the extreme cold of high-altitude combat over Europe, somewhere over the Low Countries or western Germany, the American fighters would waggle their wings in farewell and turn for home, and the bomber crews would watch them go with sinking hearts, knowing what was coming next. The Luftwaffe called. At the happy hunting grounds, that deadly stretch of airspace over Germany, where the bombers flew without escort, German fighter pilots racked up stunning kill totals. Aces with 50, 70, 100 victories were not uncommon. The air war was becoming a war of attrition that America was losing. The P-51 Mustang was born not from American foresight but from British desperation. In 1940, with the Battle of Britain raging and fighter command desperately short of modern fighters, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American aviation with a request: build Curtiss P-40 fighters under license to supplement British defenses. North American's chief designer, James "Dutch" Kindleberger, made a bold counter-proposal. Instead of building someone else's outdated design, give us 120 days and we'll design and build a completely new fighter, one that's better than anything. Currently in production, it was an audacious claim. Aircraft design typically took years, but Kindleberger had a team of brilliant engineers, including lead designer Edgar Schmude, and access to recent aerodynamic research from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. What emerged from the design studios was revolutionary. A fighter built around the new laminar flow wing, a design that reduced drag dramatically at high speeds. The fuselage was smoothly contoured, with the radiator positioned under the fuselage in a carefully designed duct that actually produced a small amount of forward thrust from the cooling airflow, a concept called the Meredith effect. Every line of the aircraft was optimized for speed and efficiency. The prototype flew in October 1940, a mere 102 days after the contract was signed. It was fast, nearly 400 miles per hour with the Allison engine installed. The British took delivery of the first production models in 1941 and deployed them with the Royal Air Force, primarily in the low-altitude tactical reconnaissance and ground attack roles. And there the Mustang might have remained a useful but unremarkable fighter except for one crucial modification. In 1942, Ronald Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, flew a Mustang and immediately recognized that the airframe was exceptional, but the Allison engine was holding it back. The Allison performed well at low altitude, but lost power rapidly above 15,000 feet, exactly where the air war over Europe was being fought. Harker proposed fitting the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same supercharged V-12 that powered the Spitfire. The Merlin was optimized for high-altitude performance, maintaining power well above 25,000 feet. The combination was transformative. With the Merlin engine built under license in the United States by Packard, the Mustang became the P-51B, and later the definitive P-51D. Top speed jumped to over 440 miles per hour. Service ceiling reached 41,900 feet. But most importantly, range, the critical factor that had doomed every other fighter, was extended dramatically by the Mustang's fuel-efficient design. With internal fuel tanks and two 75-gallon drop tanks slung under the wings, the P-51 could escort bombers to Berlin and back, a round trip of over 1,200 miles. No other fighter in the world could match that combination of speed, altitude performance, maneuverability, and range. In December 1943, the first Mustang groups arrived in England and began flying escort missions with the 8th Air Force. The Germans took little notice. They should have. The Luftwaffe pilots who had ruled the skies over the Reich were not fools. They were, in many cases, the most experienced and skilled fighter pilots in the world. Men like Adolf Galland, Gunther Rahl, Johannes Steinhoff aces, with hundreds of kills between them. Veterans of campaigns stretching from Spain to Poland to France to Russia. They flew excellent aircraft, the Bf-109G, with its powerful Daimler-Benz engine and heavy armament, and the FW-190A, a radial-engined fighter that combined ruggedness with devastating firepower. These were men who had been fighting and winning. In the air for years, they had defeated the French, battled the British to a standstill, and were now slaughtering American bombers by the dozen. When the first Mustangs appeared over Germany in early 1944, the initial encounters were inconclusive. Small groups of P-51s clashed with German fighters on the fringes of bomber formations, and both sides claimed victories. But the Luftwaffe High Command was not impressed. The Americans had good planes before the P-47 was fast and tough. The P-38 had decent range, but they had all been dealt with. The Mustang would be no different. What the Germans failed to grasp initially was the strategic revolution the Mustang represented. This was not just another fighter with slightly better performance. This was a fighter that could go anywhere. The bombers could go, that could stay with them through the entire mission, from takeoff in England to the target in Germany and back home again. For the first time, the Luftwaffe would have to fight for air superiority over their own homeland, not just during brief, predictable bomber raids, but continuously against an enemy who would not go away. The German pilots expected the Mustangs to behave like other American fighters, stay close to the bombers, fly in rigid formations, prioritize defensive escort over aggressive combat. That was the American doctrine. After all, protect the bombers, win the war through strategic bombing. But in early 1944, a new directive came down from 8th Air Force headquarters, issued by Lieutenant General James Doolittle, who had taken command in January. The directive fundamentally changed the rules of engagement. Mustang pilots were authorized and encouraged even to leave the bomber formations and pursue German fighters aggressively. The goal was no longer merely to defend the bombers. The goal was to destroy the Luftwaffe. Our job, Doolittle told his fighter commanders, is to destroy German fighters. Destroy them on the ground, destroy them in the air, destroy them wherever we find them. The best way to protect bombers is to make sure there are no German fighters left to attack them. It was a subtle but profound shift in strategy. The Mustangs were no longer passive guardians. They were hunters. February 20th, 1944, the Americans launch Big Week, a coordinated series of massive bombing raids targeting German aircraft production facilities. Over 6 days, the 8th Air Force and 5th 10th Air Force, supported by RAF Bomber Command, will fly nearly 6,000 bomber sorties against factories, assembly plants, and component manufacturers scattered across Germany. It is the largest and most ambitious air offensive of the war to date, and flying escort for those bombers, ranging hundreds of miles deep into enemy territory, are the Mustangs. The Luftwaffe responds in force. This is an existential threat. If the Americans destroy Germany's ability to build fighters, the war in the air is lost. Hundreds of Bf-109s and FW-190s scramble to intercept the bomber streams. The sky over central Germany becomes a sprawling, chaotic battlefield, stretching across hundreds of miles, involving thousands of aircraft and the German pilots engaging. American fighters deep over their own territory for the first time make a terrible discovery. The Mustang is not what they expected, that it is fast or faster than their own fighters at most altitudes. At 25,000 feet, where the Merlin engine hits its stride, the Mustang can outrun a Bf-109G. It is maneuverable, with light, responsive controls that allow it to turn tightly despite its size. The laminar flow wing gives it excellent performance in both horizontal and vertical maneuvering. But most shockingly, it is here, hundreds of miles from its bases in England, with enough fuel to dogfight aggressively for 30 minutes or more before turning for home. The Mustang pilots are not flying cautiously, husbanding fuel for the long flight back. They are diving into German formations, breaking up attacks on the bombers, pursuing fleeing enemy fighters, engaging in turning dogfights at altitudes where the Germans thought they were untouchable. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, the Luftwaffe ace flying with Jagdgeschwader 11, records his shock in his diary after an encounter with Mustangs over Brunswick. Where do these fighters come from? They are everywhere. We cannot shake them. I tried to dive away from one, but he followed me down, staying right on my tail. His speed in the dive was incredible. I pulled up hard, and he pulled up with me. I have never seen an American fighter do this before. We are in serious trouble. Over the course of Big Week, the story repeats across the skies of Germany. Luftwaffe pilots who had grown accustomed to slaughtering unescorted bombers now find themselves fighting for their lives against aggressive, well-flown fighters that appear without warning and refuse to go away. German losses mount alarmingly. On February 22nd alone, the Luftwaffe loses 61 fighters. The Americans lose 41 bombers, still a high number, but a dramatic improvement over previous missions. And critically, the ratio is shifting. The Luftwaffe is losing more fighters than the Americans are losing bombers. For a force already stretched thin, facing enemies on multiple fronts, leading experienced pilots in combat over Germany and Russia and Italy, this is unsustainable. March 4th, 1944. The first American bombing raid on Berlin, the capital of the Third Reich, the seat of Nazi power, has been bombed before the British have been hitting it at night for years, but never. In daylight, never by American heavy bombers. The distance from England to Berlin is over 1,100 miles round trip. No fighter escort has ever been able to reach it. Until now, 30 groups of B-17s and B-24s, escorted by P-51 Mustangs, set course for Berlin. The Luftwaffe High Command, monitoring the incoming raid on radar, scrambles every available fighter. This is an insult that cannot be tolerated. Berlin is supposed to be invulnerable to daylight attack. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarshal and commander of the Luftwaffe, had promised Hitler personally that no enemy bomber would ever reach the capital. That promise has already been broken by the British night raids, a humiliation that cost Göring much of his influence. Now the Americans are coming in broad daylight. The German fighters rise to meet the bombers over the outskirts of Berlin, and the Mustangs are there, waiting. What follows is a sprawling air battle over the heart of Nazi Germany, fought in full view of the population below. Contrails crisscross the sky in tangled patterns. Machine guns and cannon fire stitch tracer. lines through the air. Fighters tumble earthward, trailing smoke and flame. Parachutes blossom like white flowers against the gray winter sky. In the streets below, Berliners who had been assured of German air superiority, who had been told that the Luftwaffe was invincible, watch in stunned disbelief as American fighters dogfight with German defenders directly over the city. The raid causes relatively light damage. Cloud cover obscures many of the targets, but the psychological impact is immense. Berlin has been reached. The myth of the impregnable Reich is shattered, and the Mustangs, those fighters the Luftwaffe pilots had dismissed as inconsequential, have flown all the way to the enemy capital and back, fighting the entire way. In the days and weeks that follow, the raids continue. Berlin is hit again on March 6th, March 8th, March 9th. Each time the Mustangs are there. The bomber losses, while still significant, are manageable. The Luftwaffe losses are not. In March 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe loses over 560 fighters defending Germany. Experienced pilots, men whose skills had been honed over years of combat, are killed or captured at a rate the training pipeline cannot replace. The new pilots arriving at frontline squadrons are greener, less skilled, more likely to make fatal mistakes. Adolf Galland, the General der Jagdflieger, the general in command of all German fighter forces, writes in his post-war memoir about the March raids. The appearance of the Mustang over Berlin was a turning point in the air war. For the first time, we had to fight for air superiority over Germany itself against an enemy who could reach any target in the Reich. Our pilots, who had been so confident, began to understand that we were fighting an opponent with inexhaustible resources. We could shoot down 10 Mustangs, and 20 would appear the next day. We could claim 50 victories, and 100 new American pilots would arrive to replace the ones we killed. The Americans were not simply fighting with better planes. They were fighting with the productive capacity of an entire continent, and we had no answer to that. The Mustang was not just a machine. It was a symbol of something deeper, something that terrified the Nazi leadership more than any single weapon. American industrial power. Germany had entered the war with the finest military in the world, built on a foundation of tactical excellence, operational art, and technological innovation. The Wehrmacht had crushed Poland in weeks, defeated France in 6 weeks, conquered Yugoslavia in 11 days. The Luftwaffe had swept the skies clear, opposition from Warsaw to Paris. German tanks, an aircraft were, plane for plane and tank for tank, often superior to their Allied counterparts. German doctrine emphasized speed, maneuver, and the concentration of force at decisive points. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. It had worked brilliantly against opponents who were unprepared, outmaneuvered, psychologically shattered. But wars are not won by tactical brilliance alone. They are won by economies, by factories, by the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. And in this arena, Nazi Germany was hopelessly outmatched. The United States in 1944 was the greatest industrial power in human history. American factories were producing 1 aircraft every 5 minutes, 1 tank every 7 minutes, 1 ship every day. The arsenal of democracy, Roosevelt had called it, and the name was not hyperbole. The sheer scale of American production was almost incomprehensible. In 1944 alone, The United States produced over 96,000 aircraft. Germany, by contrast, produced approximately 39,000, and that was with the entire economy on a total war footing, with slave labor and brutal efficiency. Measures. The P-51 Mustang was a product of that industrial system. North American aviation built over 15,000 Mustangs between 1941 and 1945. The Packard Motor Company built tens of thousands of Merlin engines. Thousands of subcontractors provided components, instruments, radios, guns, tires, propellers, fuel tanks. The entire production system was optimized for speed and volume. A Mustang could be built, tested, and delivered in weeks. Pilots were trained in vast numbers at airfields scattered across the American South and West, flying hundreds of hours before ever seeing combat. When a Mustang was lost over Germany, another was already rolling off the assembly line to replace it. When a pilot was killed, two more were graduating from flight school. The German pilots, fighting desperately over their homeland, came to understand this terrible arithmetic. They could be individually superior, better trained, more experienced, flying in defense of their own soil and still lose because the enemy simply had more of everything. More planes, more pilots, more fuel, more ammunition, more of the rubber and aluminum and steel and oil that modern war devoured in vast quantities. The Mustang embodied this abundance in a way that was almost cruel. It was not a stripped-down, makeshift fighter cobbled together from scarce resources. It was beautifully engineered, full of sophisticated features. The cockpit was spacious and ergonomically designed. The canopy provided excellent visibility in all directions, a crucial advantage in air combat. Later models had the bubble canopy, giving the pilot a 360-degree view. The gun sight was a gyroscopic computing sight, calculating lead angles automatically. The gun's 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns in the wings were reliable and hard-hitting, with hundreds of rounds of ammunition per gun. The radio was clear and dependable. There was even a relief tube so pilots wouldn't have to endure bladder discomfort on 8-hour missions. German pilots, by contrast, were flying aircraft built under increasingly desperate conditions. Slave laborers in underground factories, sabotaging components when they could. Shortages of aluminum forcing the use of substitute materials. Fuel quality declining as refineries were bombed and synthetic production faltered. Late war Luftwaffe. Fighters were often painted in rough, mottled camouflage because there wasn't enough paint for proper finishes. Instruments failed, radios malfunctioned, guns jammed, and the pilots themselves were tired, flying multiple sorties per day, eating ersatz food, sleeping in bunkers to avoid Allied bombing raids on their own airfields. The contrast was stark and demoralizing. The Americans flew in formations so large, they darkened the sky, escorted by fighters that seemed inexhaustible. The Germans scrambled in 2s and 4s, hoarding fuel, rationing ammunition, knowing that every aircraft lost was one more that probably wouldn't be replaced. April 1944. The air war over Germany has become a grinding campaign of attrition. The Luftwaffe is still dangerous. Individual pilots still score kills. The flak defenses are formidable. The bomber losses continue, but the trend is unmistakable. The Mustangs are everywhere now, not just escorting bombers, but flying fighter sweeps, roaming ahead of the bomber formations to clear the sky of enemy fighters, and ramrods, fighter-bomber missions attacking ground targets. The Luftwaffe is being forced into an impossible dilemma: scramble to defend against the bombers and face the Mustangs at high altitude, or stay on the ground and let the bombers destroy German industry unopposed. Some Luftwaffe units begin to avoid combat with Mustangs entirely, focusing on the bombers and breaking off when the escorts arrive. But this is a losing strategy if the fighters won't engage. The bombers get through, and the factories and refineries and rail yards are destroyed. Other units try to overwhelm the escorts with numbers, throwing large formations of fighters at the Americans in hopes of breaking through to the bombers by sheer weight of numbers. But the Mustang pilots are aggressive and well-trained, and they fight with a confidence born of knowing that they have the better machine. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer, commander of the 352nd Fighter Group, one of the most successful Mustang units, describes the shift in his memoir. In early '44, we were the underdogs, trying to protect the bombers and stay alive. By spring, we were the hunters. We'd see a gaggle of Krauts forming up to attack the bombers, and we'd dive right into them, break up their formations before they could coordinate and attack. They started to avoid us. You could see it. They'd spot us and turn away, looking for an easier target. That's when you knew we'd won. When the enemy is afraid to fight you, you've already won. The statistics bear this out. In April 1944, the 8th Air Force flies 22,000 bomber sorties and loses 409 bombers, an attrition rate under 2%. It is still a heavy toll, but it is sustainable. The Luftwaffe losses are not. Over 1,000 German fighters are lost in combat or accidents. In April alone, the training units can barely keep up. New pilots are arriving at squadrons with as little as 50 hours of flight time, when American pilots typically had 200 hours or more. The Luftwaffe is being bled white, and the Mustang pilots are running up kill scores that rival the German aces. Major George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group shoots down 6 enemy aircraft in a single mission on August 6, 1944. Captain Don Gentile, flying with the 4th Fighter Group, becomes a national hero in America with 22 kills. Chuck Yeager, who will later become the first man to break the sound barrier, shoots down his first enemy aircraft flying a Mustang in March 1944, and will end the war with 11.5 kills, including 5 in a single day. The top American aces are still a long way from the 100-kill totals of some German pilots, but the gap is narrowing, and the momentum has shifted decisively. By summer 1944, the Luftwaffe over Germany has been effectively broken as a strategic force. It still exists. Fighters still scramble to meet the bomber raids, and Allied aircrews still die in significant numbers, but the Luftwaffe can no longer prevent the bombers from reaching their targets. The oil refineries at Ploesti are destroyed. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt are wrecked. The aircraft production facilities across Germany are bombed repeatedly. The transportation network is shattered. And over it all, the Mustangs fly silver and deadly, the masters of the sky. The symbolic power of this reversal cannot be overstated. The Luftwaffe had been the terror weapon of the early war. the instrument of Blitzkrieg, the force that rained death on Warsaw and Rotterdam and London. Now it was hunted in its own skies by an enemy it had dismissed as inferior. The psychological impact on the German population was profound. The Nazi propaganda machine had spent years assuring Germans that the fatherland was invincible, that German technology and fighting spirit were superior, that final victory was inevitable. But the reality was impossible to deny. American fighters flew over German cities at will, and there was nothing the vaunted Luftwaffe could do to stop them. Galland, in a meeting with Hitler in late 1944, tries to explain the hopelessness of the situation. Mein Führer, we are outnumbered 10-1. Our pilots are exhausted. Our fuel supplies are nearly gone. The enemy can replace his losses overnight. We cannot. Unless production is increased dramatically, unless we can get more fuel, more pilots, better training, Hitler cuts him off, raging about defeatism and cowardice. The Luftwaffe must fight harder. The new jet fighters, the Me-262, will turn the tide. Victory is still possible, but Galland knows better. He has seen the Mustangs over Berlin. He knows what they represent. The war is lost, even if the Führer cannot admit it. The P-51 Mustang flew in every theater of World War II. In the Pacific, Mustangs escorted B-29 superfortresses on raids against Japan, flying from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back an even longer mission than Berlin. In the Mediterranean, they supported the invasion of southern France and the grinding campaign up the Italian peninsula. In China, Burma, India, they escorted bombers over the Himalayas and strafed Japanese positions in the jungle. Over 15,000 were built. They served with the air forces of at least 25 nations. They remained in frontline service for years after the war, fighting in Korea, serving as interceptors and attack aircraft well into the 1950s. But it is the missions over Germany in 1944 that define the Mustang's legacy. The missions that broke the Luftwaffe. The missions that proved strategic bombing could work if the bombers had proper escort. The missions that allowed the Allied invasion of France to proceed without serious interference from German air power, because the Luftwaffe had been destroyed in the skies over the Reich. The missions that brought the war home to Germany in a way that could not be ignored or denied. The Mustang was, in the end, more than just an excellent fighter aircraft. It was the physical manifestation of American industrial power, a message delivered in aluminum and firepower. You cannot outproduce us, you cannot outlast us, and eventually, inevitably, we will win. The German pilots who survived the war, and many did not carry memories of those silver fighters for the rest of their lives. Heinz Nock, who survived 400 combat missions and 52 confirmed kills, wrote in his diary, "I dreamed of Mustangs last night. I have dreamed of them every night for a year. They are always there, always behind me, always closing in. I wake in a cold sweat. Even now, years after the war, I sometimes hear a distant aircraft engine and feel my heart race. The sound takes me back to 1944, to those terrible months when we knew we were losing, when every mission might be our last, when the American fighters were everywhere and we were powerless to stop them." Johann Steinhoff, another ace who survived to become a general in the post-war German Air Force, was more philosophical. The Mustang did not just defeat us in the air. It defeated the idea that will and courage and individual skill could triumph over material superiority. We were told that one German was worth 10 enemies, that our cause was just, that our technology was superior. But in the end, none of that mattered. They had more planes, more pilots, more fuel, more everything. The Mustang taught us that modern war is not decided by heroes. It is decided by factories. There is a photograph taken in the spring of 1945 that captures something essential about the Mustang's war. It shows a P-51D, polished and gleaming, parked on a captured German airfield. In the background, scattered across the field, are the burned-out hulks of Luftwaffe fighters B, F-109s, FW-190s, even a few of the exotic late-war jets. The German aircraft are wrecked, destroyed on the ground by strafing attacks or deliberately sabotaged by their own crews to prevent capture. The Mustang sits among them, pristine and untouched, a conqueror on the ruins of the conquered. The image is almost too perfect, too symbolic. But it is real, and it tells the story of the air war in microcosm. The sleek American fighter built by the thousands, delivered on time and in quantity, standing victorious over the remnants of an air force that had once ruled the skies of Europe. The Mustang pilots who flew those missions, the men who took the war to the heart of Germany, who fought their way through flak and fighters to escort the bombers to Berlin and Dresden and Munich and back, were mostly young men, many barely out of their teens. They came from farms in Iowa and factories in Detroit and small towns scattered across America. They were not professional warriors. They were citizens in uniform doing a job that needed to be done. And when the war ended, most of them came home, traded their flight suits for civilian clothes, and disappeared back into the vast American landscape from which they had emerged. But for a few years, in the skies over Europe, they flew the finest fighter aircraft of the war. They broke the back of the Luftwaffe. They made strategic bombing possible. They helped win the war. And they did it in a machine that the enemy had once dismissed with laughter, right up until the moment it appeared over Berlin, and the laughter died in their throats. The Mustang was fast. It was graceful. It was beautiful in the way that functional things, perfectly suited to their purpose, are beautiful. But more than anything, it was effective. It did the job it was designed to do, and it did it better than any other fighter of its time. That is the measure of a weapon, not how impressive it looks in a museum, but how well it performs when lives are on the line, and the outcome hangs in the balance. The Luftwaffe laughed at the Mustang, but by the time they understood what it really was, by the time they grasped the implications of a fighter that could go anywhere, fight anyone, and come back to do it again the next day, it was far too late. The silver fighters were already over Berlin, and the war was already lost. In the end. That is what the Mustang proved. That freedom, backed by the industrial might of a democratic nation, is a force that no tyranny, however ruthless, however fanatical, can withstand forever. The Mustang did not win the war alone. No single weapon ever does. But it gave the men who fought that war the tool they needed to carry the fight to the enemy's heartland and finish the job. And in the history of air warfare, and the long story of how technology and courage and strategy intersect to determine the fate of nations. The P-51 Mustang will always hold a place of honor, the fighter that the enemy dismissed, and that ended up escorting the bombers all the way to Berlin and beyond into the pages of history.